Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you had a good weekend. Now that we've gotten some official numbers from Nintendo, and since we've had some official numbers from other providers over the past month, I figured it would be fun to do some kind of analysis, gauge where the Switch 2 sales currently stand, how they got there, and where they might go after this. So first, I'd like to start this off with the easy one, or maybe I should say the least controversial one. As of the end of June 2025, Nintendo has shown us that they sent out 1.34 million Switch 2 units to Europe. Again, these are sell-in numbers which are shipped. We don't actually have any data on how many were sold. Taking data from VG Charts' estimates, which ranges from very reliable to not reliable at all depending on how well it fits people's narrative, they've predicted that the Nintendo Switch 2 sold 1.1 million units there in its first month. And when I say first month, I mean through the end of June. If I'm not mistaken, the numbers in Europe are pretty hard to track. Some of the bigger countries will provide numbers, and they'll use those numbers to estimate what some of the smaller countries are bringing in. But even if you were to look at just software sales alone and you take Mario Kart World and assume that there's a certain attachment rate, everything kind of points to right around just over that million sales mark. Nintendo never officially announced that they sold 1 million units in Europe, but I mean, if it's not 1 million, it's probably just shy of 1 million anyway. The only point that I think might be worth talking about is there are a lot of people all around Europe that talk about just how expensive the Switch 2 is, and many of them have been saying that it's been in stock since the day the console launched, but obviously on the opposite side of the spectrum you have people that are saying that they haven't seen it since opening day. Whatever the case is, I think it's safe to assume that it is around 1 million, maybe 10% more, 10% less, and it's not entirely insane that Nintendo shipped out 1.34 million units. Even if a lot of those additional 0.34 million units were being moved well into July. Okay, that's easy enough. Let's move on to America. Or the Americas, rather. So we know that Nintendo shipped out 2.08 million units through the month of June. Again, these are sell-in numbers, these are shipped numbers. We also know that historically speaking, roughly 85 to 90% of all sales in the Americas tend to be part of the United States alone. And as a result, obviously the sales in the United States are what's mostly closely followed and most analyzed. So we have data from Circana that says that the United States sold 1.6 million units in June. I made a video about the 1.6 million a few weeks ago. I compared it to the test data that was accidentally leaked on Nintendo's website. My assumption was, and might still be, that Nintendo's test data was actually what they initially had shipped and what they were hoping to sell through in the first month, but that is entirely just a guess at this point. Some people might even call it a conspiracy, especially when we get to the Japanese numbers and the rest of the world numbers. But whatever the case is, in regards to America, my assumption was that they sent 1.8 million units to the United States and they only managed to sell 1.6 units. Now, that statement and that video garnered a lot of attention, specifically from some people on Twitter. I had made a correction in the following video as soon as it started, before other people even started talking about it, I think. Or at least before I found out they were talking about it. And I think I actually made the correction in the comments section and pinned it, if I'm not mistaken, on the same day that I had uploaded the video. But obviously throughout that entire video I spoke about a lot of different things, so I just didn't take it down. It was just one small portion of it. In any case, the individual that made the correction about my statement actually was more wrong than I was, but I didn't feel like stirring up any drama. They were trying to correct me, but they corrected me the wrong way. They didn't point out that I had mistaken what was sold in the United States for what was sold in the Americas altogether. Rather, they said that the 1.6 million sales does not include My Nintendo Store. Now, I'm here to correct that because the 1.6 million sales do include My Nintendo Store. The logic that the individual used on Twitter was that the 1.1 million did not include the My Nintendo Store's numbers, and they even shared a link for it. And while yes, they were correct that the 1.1 million sales did not include the My Nintendo Store's numbers, and the assumption is that if you include the My Nintendo Store's numbers, the sales for the opening 4 days of the Switch 2's life in the United States was around 1.3 to 1.35 million. But in the case of the 1.6 million number, if you dig around, and Lord knows I like to dig around, way back on June 13th, Matt Piscatella pointed out that while the weekly sales will not include the My Nintendo Store numbers, the units will be included in the monthly reports. So we know that 2.08 million were sent out to the Americas, and 1.6 million were actually sold in the United States. So if we were being generous, of that 2.08 million, we could probably say about 15% of it was allocated to the areas outside of the United States, which means in the United States you had around 1.75 to maybe 1.8 million units available, while the rest of the region would have allocated roughly 300,000 units. And again, these are just estimates based off of market trends. Now, similar to all of these obscure areas around Europe, Canada, Central America, and South America had Switch 2 prices that were very high, and there were a lot of people reporting that they've been on shelves and very hard to move. I'd be willing to wager that they realistically had a better sell-through rate in the United States. And I'm guessing that the only place in the world that sold through the Switch 2s better than they did in the United States was probably Japan. So my guess, and this is just a guess, if that test data was anything tangible, which I have to remind you guys that Nintendo said that that test data meant nothing, I'm assuming that they had initially allocated 1.8 million for the region and they just didn't sell through that 1.8 million. I don't know at what point they realized they were not going to hit that 1.8 million units, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that they saw that the United States was moving quicker than everywhere else, and they just decided to ship as many units as possible there as quickly as they can, so they can increase the sales in the United States and also increase that sell-in number in preparation for the quarterly report. And again, I don't have anything tangible to back that up. All I know is that somewhere through the second or third week of July, all of a sudden there were just tons of Switch 2s available. Almost immediately, we went from this thing being drip-fed throughout the month to just being on shelves where it has remained now for the better part of the past 3 weeks. And if you happen to go into your store and you don't see it on a shelf and you live in the United States, go to Target.com, BestBuy.com, Costco.com, SamsClub.com, and Walmart.com and you can order yourself a Switch 2 right now. It's been available since mid-July, I think. And I actually think when they shipped in all of these units, they had a massive push in the month of July. And it's going to make the July numbers look very good. And obviously that's what Nintendo wanted, because that way they could say that they hit 6 million units, and the United States actually helped them get to that target. And at the same time, it also allowed them to have 5.82 million units shipped on their quarterly report without having to address the fact that they probably didn't hit 5 million units by the end of the month, which I'm assuming was their internal projection. So the way it seems to me is that they had stockpiled a whole bunch of units so they can have that giant record-breaking launch. They didn't quite sell out as much as they wanted around the world throughout the end of the month. They needed to pump the numbers as best as they could before the quarterly report, and that was right around the time that the market was completely flooded so that they can hit that 6 million number. The risky part here is that now that they've flooded the market in the United States, and now that without question people can no longer argue that the Switch 2 is not readily available, stock will no longer be used as an excuse. And if this trend of the Switch 2s just being available at all times continues, once we get to August 27th and we see the numbers for the month of July, it's realistically going to show very healthy numbers for that month. But if this trend continues and stocks are available and scalpers are clearly no longer buying anything, the months of August and September could show heavy declines for the Nintendo Switch 2. Which is why I still think that despite the fact that this thing as of July 24th hit 6 million units sold, I'm still guessing it's going to be between 7 and 8 million by the time we hit September 30th. But obviously that's just a prediction based off of somebody that doesn't know anything. Next up, we have the numbers in Japan. So a lot of people have been very confused about this one because Japanese numbers were probably the biggest head scratcher once the quarterly reports came out for Nintendo. Remember, just about all month, people have been celebrating just how quickly the Switch 2 was moving in Japan. And they were primarily doing that based off of the Famitsu sales numbers. Now, the Famitsu sales numbers were actually not that off when you consider that this is an industry estimate. By June 29th, they said that there was about 1.4 million Switch 2s sold, and that's sold to the customer. But of course, Nintendo reports that by June 30th, only 1.27 were actually shipped. So you have sold numbers that are higher than shipped numbers, which creates confusion. The thing is, the margin for error here is about 10%, which is not terrible. The problem, however, lies in the fact that many people have been under the assumption that Famitsu Sales does not track My Nintendo Store. But they also do not track e-commerce or online sales, like Amazon and the like. So the estimates were that this thing had sold more in Japan than they did in the United States, around 1.7 to 1.8 million, which would obviously be way higher than the 1.27 million that was sold in Japan, or shipped. Basically the amount that was either distributed through retailers or sold through the My Nintendo Store. So since the numbers have come out, a lot of people have been saying that maybe Famitsu was actually trying to include the My Nintendo Store numbers and they overestimated, but I've seen nothing to back up that claim. The only thing I keep seeing is that Famitsu Sales is not tracking the My Nintendo Store numbers and they're not tracking online sales. I actually decided to mess around with Google Translate and see if I can find any kind of press release from Famitsu in Japanese. And I must have stumbled on forums for Sony fanboys because I saw a lot of people really hating on Famitsu and Nintendo. There were a few people that said that Nintendo might be lying about the sales, but it seemed like most people were saying that they assumed that Famitsu Sales was the one that was overinflating the sales for Nintendo's sake because they wanted to make it seem like the Switch 2 was doing much better in Japan than it actually was. So basically, they're of the opinion that Famitsu was drastically blowing it out of proportion, pretending the Switch 2 was doing much better in Japan just to make it so that public perception is that the Switch 2 is a runaway success and greater than anything they've ever seen. These are the local Japanese, probably Sony fanboys' words, not mine. But whatever the case is, a lot of them seem to have been rolling their eyes because they're like, basically, Famitsu is clearly not going to address this at all. And many people think they're just going to ignore it because their estimate is close enough and they don't have any official statement talking about My Nintendo Store or e-commerce, so they'll just go with it and keep moving along. But there are random bloggers who are going hard against both Nintendo and Famitsu sales, claiming that there's some kind of shady stuff going on. Now, in the case of Japan specifically, when a Switch 2 makes it to the shelf, if it even makes it to the shelf, it gets sold immediately. Perhaps it's the only place in the world that has that luxury. Although while I was digging through some of these Japanese forums, there were a lot of locals who were saying the opposite. It was actually a weird experience because over here, a lot of people talk about how in Japan they all love Nintendo and it's Nintendo's country, and that clearly over there they don't really criticize Nintendo too much and they're all just willing to buy whatever Nintendo puts out. But I saw some posts in forums that were really ripping on Americans. They were saying that if you go to the bigger cities and the busier areas, you're not going to find any Switch 2s available, but if you go out to the rural areas, it's going to be available a lot and it's hard to move off the shelves, which is very similar to what's going on here in the West. And then funnily enough, I also saw a lot of posts talking about how Westerners are kind of foolish with their money and will buy anything. So they were saying that it's going to be easy for Nintendo to be a success because they're just going to cater to the Western populace that is willing to spend money without thinking. So basically over here in America, we're like, yeah, Japan is gonna make this thing inflate numbers. And then over in Japan, they're gonna be like, America's gonna make this thing inflate numbers. And the reality is it's probably both somewhere in the middle. Yeah. The funny thing is, a lot of them did mention the price point. They were saying that in the West, they're paying too much. And they were saying that in like a haha kind of way. Like, oh yeah, even over there, they have to pay more and they're still buying it. I obviously can't speak for every single Japanese person. This is me just scrolling through random forums of fanatics. But obviously, as we all know, the Switch 2 is priced a little bit more fair in Japan than the rest of the world. And that's part of the reason why I've made a lot of assumptions that it's selling very well in Japan and it's actually inflating the numbers a bit. Now, whatever the case is, there's clearly a big discrepancy between what was sold in Japan and what was estimated to have been sold in Japan. But Japan is not the only part of all of this that has a weird discrepancy. When the quarterly reports came out and a lot of people saw that Japan's numbers were low, they were kind of worried because they're like, oh, we thought this was going to be way higher. That's how the Switch 2 hit 5 million. How did it still hit 5 million if Japan did not reach that same target that the experts were estimating? And that's because outside of Japan, there is still one more region, or one more category of regions rather. And that's the other category. Those are the numbers that are not applicable to the Americas, numbers that are not applicable to Japan and Europe as well. The other region shows that 1.13 million units were sold, which is unheard of. Like, that's way higher than anybody could ever assume that was going to happen for the other region. Like, most experts were putting this at roughly half of that. And as a matter of fact, if you bring back that test data that Nintendo had accidentally put on their website, even they, within that 5 million units that they were expected to sell, had only allocated 550,000 or 0.55 million, if you will, for the other category. So the numbers there have more than doubled. Now, this is the part where it gets a bit questionable. Like, we're at straight up conspiracy theory levels here. And there is nothing to back up anything that I am saying at this point. Because of this big discrepancy between the Nintendo of Japan number and the other number, some people are wondering, I being one of them, if Nintendo changed the way they consider a Japanese sale as opposed to an other sale. Like, you know, there are two different types of Switch 2s that are being sold in Japan. There are the ones that are cheaper, which are Japanese only, and then there are the international models. I believe they're calling them multilingual systems. So maybe Nintendo is only considering the ones that are Japanese only as Japanese sales and the other one as other sales. Or maybe in the past they used to sell units to specific retailers and those retailers would take them and go sell them elsewhere. And in the past, Nintendo just considered that a Japanese sale. But now that they have better data on the matter, they've decided to not consider it a Japanese sale anymore. Right, these are all just what ifs and assumptions, and they could mean nothing. But the big reason why this is very confusing to a lot of people is not just because the other is overperforming and the numbers in Japan are below what we expected. It's more so because of how eerily similar those numbers actually are once you shift them around a little bit. So like I said before, in that test data, the 1.55 million that were available for the other region, if those were the numbers that were actually originally allocated for the Nintendo Switch 2, and then now in the quarterly reports it shows that there's 1.13 million available for that other region, well, you're looking at a difference of roughly 580,000 units. And then if you take that 580,000 units and you add it on to the 1.27 million units that were said to be sold in Japan, you're sitting at 1.85 million units for Japan. And these are sell-in numbers. So if 1.85 million units were sold in for Japan, and then the analysts and experts are predicting that 1.7 to 1.8 million were actually being sold through to the consumer, those numbers would line up much better. But again, there is zero proof of this, and this is not me making a claim on Nintendo or anything. It's just when you dig deep into the numbers and you analyze them, it's funny, right? And I think it's a large part of the reason why some people have been making claims about Famitsu and Nintendo. There is one flaw in this theory, however, and it's why I'm questionable about it at best. Actually, realistically, there's more than one flaw, but there's one that I'm thinking about right now. If we're taking the test data at face value, that test data showed that Japan had only 1.47 million units shipped, which would still be below the estimates now if we're talking about 1.7 to 1.8 million. But you also have to remember that Japan and the United States are probably the fastest selling areas for the Nintendo Switch 2, with Japan probably having an even quicker turnaround time between shipped and stocked and sold. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that within the second or third week of the Switch 2's life cycle, they pumped more units out to get more units sold in Japan because it was selling very well, in the same way that I imagine they pumped out more units in the United States to get those numbers up there as well. So this theory could still technically work. Is it realistic? Probably not. But it is very interesting that almost the exact number of sales that went into the other regions is how much was missing from the Japanese sales based off of the early estimates. And this is not to say that Nintendo is fudging numbers. This is not to say that they're doing anything illegal. It could just be a change in what they consider a Japanese sale versus not a Japanese sale. Or it could just mean that the quarterly reports are accurate and the test data was nothing but test data and didn't mean anything. And Famitsu sales and the experts and the analysts are all just way off and assuming that the Switch 2 was doing much better in Japan than it actually did, and I could have just wasted 16 and a half minutes of your time. Whatever the case is, as I made clear in my previous video, the Nintendo Switch 2 sales are at 6 million as of July 24th. Those numbers are still very top heavy, 3.5 million in the first 4 days, 2.5 million over the course of the following 45. Outside of the first few weeks of that, stock was drastically being withheld in a lot of areas. But now, at least in the United States, which makes up a decent percentage of the sales of the Switch 2, stock is there, it's been there, and it seems like it's going to be there for a while. And I understand that having a lot of stock available does not always mean that people are not buying them, but I believe it was around April of 2023 when people finally started saying that the PS5 was being sold at a loss by scalpers, and it was within the mid to end of 2022 that the PlayStation 5s were actually just more commonly seen on shelves in stores. So you're looking at between 20 to maybe 30 million PlayStation 5s were sold off of shelves immediately by scalpers, and people were paying more money for them because of how badly they wanted it. Whereas with the Switch 2, there are 6 million people that own one at the moment, and I doubt there are 20 million out there that are just available and that's why it's in stock. Actually, I doubt there are 10 million out there that are available and that's why it's in stock. I think there's probably 8 million out there and they're still in stock. And that's being generous. It could be 7 million. So if the Switch 2 is at 7 or 8 million units shipped by this point, which we were not provided the actual number of shipped units with the 6 million that were sold, and already this thing seems to be available on a whim worldwide outside of Japan, I don't think that bodes very well for what's to come for Nintendo. We'll have to see how this thing does in the holiday season. It's entirely possible that people looked at the price and were like, you know what, this thing isn't going anywhere. It's still available at all times. It's pretty expensive, but I'm willing to buy it at Christmas time, for example. And I think that's going to be the true test of how well the Switch 2 is actually going to perform in the long run. But as it stands, as I mentioned in the previous video and going on it again right now, I'm still pretty optimistic about how the numbers are looking. And with Nintendo's recent surveys that they released about the game key cards, with their complete silence about what's to come for the Switch 2 outside of what was already announced before, and seemingly that's not enough for many people, with their big Pokemon bundle that's coming up for a game that's going to be available on the Switch 1 as well as the Switch 2, and with my belief that they wanted to hit 5 million, didn't manage to hit 5 million by the end of June, obviously. And that's with all of the hardcore fanatics having a Switch 2 now at this point. I am very intrigued to see how this goes along over the next few months. Either way, that's all I got for you for today. Thanks again for following along, and I will catch you on the next one.